Hello and welcome to Tech Point Zero, the show about technology, people, and politics with Chris and Ben. You're listening to episode 7, released in February 2021. My name is Ben, and as ever, I'm joined by Chris. In this episode, we'll be covering the recent changes to WhatsApp's privacy policy and the current and future state of computer hardware. Let's get to it.
So before that, we'd just like to say welcome back. We're here again. We had a bit of a break as both Ben and I got very busy in our personal lives, and we couldn't dedicate the time to make this anymore. Hopefully we're now back to doing this every couple of months is the plan.
Fingers crossed.
Sort of towards the end of the month, hopefully. We've both been working from home since the pandemic hit.
Late March for me.
Was it late March? Or did you have a couple of weeks where you were...
So my company's headquarters are in Amsterdam, and I think Amsterdam went into lockdown slightly before us.
Right.
And so the basically head office was like, everybody in all of our offices work from home, wherever you are in the world.
Right. Okay.
And it was only about 4 or 5 days before we went into lockdown.
Yeah.
But it was, I think, we were a few days ahead of the country.
So that's probably quite similar to my experience then, because I had a cold just as lockdown hit, and it was one of those times where I don't know, there was a week where everyone was kind of nervous, and you sniffed once, and they were like, home now, get out. So I was just like, fine, I'll go and work from home. And then before I was completely free, because I was like, if we're going to be careful, it makes sense. The lockdown had started, and we were forced to be in the office. Sorry, everybody was forced to work from home, not in the office. Yeah. I've kind of worked from home before. I've gone back into the swing of it, but dear God, do I want to go outside at the moment?
I think that's it. I think that my overall opinion of it is I've been the same. I've worked from home before for about 8 months in a previous job, and loved it. And I love working from home again this time. The big difference when I was doing it before is that you could go outside and do things. You could go and visit family. And for me, it's not... Working from home is easy. I can do that. I can work as effectively, I believe, at home as I can in the office. What is killing it for me is not being able to see friends and family.
Yeah, not having that social contact outside of work's really difficult. I'm sure plenty of our listeners are in the same situation.
And viewers, because we're doing a video feed this time as well.
Yes, we now have a YouTube channel. We'll have details in the what is it called on podcast? The extra description
in the show notes.
The show notes. It's the doobly-doo on YouTube, so it's now doobly-doo. I think that was a John Greenism. I don't know where it originally started from.
I always want to call them blurbs, because that sort of...
Of course you do, Ben. It's we'll have links to the YouTube channel in the show notes. Please go and give that a like and subscribe.
Thumbs up.
We
don't know how much of this is getting cut.
I have no idea.
Okay, so let's start off with the WhatsApp privacy policy change. The crux of this is WhatsApp are going to require you to accept their privacy policy change, which comes into place on the 8th of February this year. That change is very basically they're going to start passing data to Facebook. A number of years ago, I think 2016, 2017, Facebook bought WhatsApp and have owned it ever since. But it's been very much operated as a separate entity until fairly recently. We've all probably, anyone that uses WhatsApp probably realised in the last year or two that when you launch WhatsApp to begin with, it says powered by Facebook or a Facebook app or something like that. This has caused a lot of people to panic or sort of consider moving off the platform. And there are a few other platforms that they can jump to. And I think it would be interesting to perhaps discuss a little bit about the pros and cons of some of those platforms.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So from what I guess, diving into some of the actual sort of privacy details, my understanding is that the Facebook will know what your telephone number is.
Yep.
And it can know what your contacts are, who your contacts are, and I'm guessing what their telephone numbers are. What it can't do still is read your messages. They can't see, Facebook cannot see what you're typing to each other.
Yep.
Because it's end-to-end encryption.
Yep.
So that bit's not going to change. Now, I don't know about you, Chris. I think my overall feeling about this is that it's not a great move in the right direction. But honestly, Facebook probably have this kind of data on me already. I have a Facebook account. I don't anymore, but in the past I have used the Facebook mobile app.
Yep.
Because they've taken Messenger out of the mobile Facebook interface, I do have Facebook Messenger on my phone.
Yep.
Which I can't remember. I may have given access to my contacts. And so really all Facebook are getting from me extra is all of that information, but what I do with it on WhatsApp.
I mean, there is an awful lot of additional information in that as well. Like the people you talk to and communicate with does reveal an awful lot about you. Even just as the metadata without all the extra, what was actually said in those messages. That being said, maybe I assume this was already happening. I don't know. I've struggled to find exact details on how big a change this actually is for most users. I know for users in the EU, they won't actually have any practical change because while they have to agree to the rules, it's not how their data is handled, I assume, because of the stronger data protection laws in the EU.
And it's probably worth mentioning, just jumping in just there and saying that for the time being, who knows for how long, the UK is still part of that sort of European model.
My understanding is that Facebook is still treating UK data as EU data, but is likely to change this year. So sometime in 2021, the UK data will be moved out of the EU data processing and over to the US data processing. I just think the using a service run by Facebook, I accept this as part of the cost. That's not a good thing. I really wish we lived in a world that wasn't like that, and I wish we had ways of communicating that were more independent of a large corporate entity.
And I was saying to a few mutual friends earlier today when this very topic was brought up, it's very much a shame that back, I think my oldest WhatsApp chat goes back to 2012. It's very much a shame that we and many other people didn't jump on a more open standards chat mechanism about 10 years ago, because even if a particular application or server got taken over by a corporate entity, they wouldn't be able to control it because you'd have this open standard that would allow other applications, other servers to come up.
I think there's an interesting point there that's been kind of tickling the back of my mind thinking about this, where I think most of them are is XMPP? Is that the name of the protocol? So most of them are XMPP behind the scenes anyway, or at least a modified version of it. They've intentionally stopped people from using the federated features. They've kept them locked down. And even Signal keeps it locked down. Like, Signal's not a federated protocol as far as I'm aware. So it seems very difficult for that kind of protocol to get started within the environment that we currently have. And I'm not aware of any that were around at that time.
No, and I think one of the problems with XMPP at the time was that it wasn't particularly mobile friendly, and specifically mobile internet friendly. You required a pretty constant connection to use it. I understand the project has moved on, or the standard has moved on, and mitigated some of those problems. And I don't know if they themselves use something like XMPP on the back end, but you've got things like Riot Messenger that is a completely open spec, and other people can come across and write applications, and as long as they conform to that spec, they can join that sort of ecosystem.
I use Riot actually daily as an IRC bridge because it just had a nicer UI and does a decent enough job of acting as an IRC bridge. And yes, I really like it. They've done a great job. The other problem though is people just aren't there. Like, if I want to sort certain groups of people, I have to go to the platform they're on. And this is part of the problem with all messaging applications, is that they're likely to end up in a single entity's control, or a very small number of entities' controls. And
we've seen this before. I certainly remember everybody, when I started really sort of jumping into sort of social media as we know it today, everyone was jumping on to MySpace.
Yep.
And then when Facebook came along, everybody moved from MySpace to Facebook. And that was a really organic move. Everybody just sort of did it. And I don't really remember people clinging on. Everyone still had their accounts. They just didn't update their newsfeed or whatever it was called back then.
Just logging into the other site.
The really interesting thing then happened. We had, for sort of people that were tech savvy at the time, we had Diaspora or Diaspora, however you pronounce it, that sort of came out. And I knew a lot of people that were jumping on there and doing both that and Facebook. And then Google Plus came along. It looked remarkably like Diaspora. Took the whole sort of circles idea and all of that. And actually, I knew a lot of people that jumped from that to Google Plus. And there were lots of people, myself included, that said, "Hey, I'm dropping Facebook. I'm all in on Google Plus."
Yeah, I was a significant user of Google Plus for a long time as well.
The problem is that the core of my friends were not there. My family wasn't there. People and there wasn't actually, if I recall, at the time, the tools on Google Plus that made Facebook so popular. The thing for me in university, as an early user of Facebook, was I'm having a party, I'm organising a night out, I can create a Facebook event, and all of my friends that are already there can jump on it. And hey, I can actually say to them, they can invite more people along as well, or not. And then, the dates changed, the venues changed, whatever. I can update all those people really easily.
Yeah, we've got a sort of network effect issue with all of these messaging apps, as well as social networks. I don't know if it's just the power of the companies that's allowed them to sort of cement control over it, or if more could be done. Like, is this? I suppose in my mind, the two other viable options are a distributed system, so Diaspora, or I'm mirroring my tweets to it. What's the other one at the moment?
Mastodon.
Mastodon, yeah. Mastodon is very, very close to replicating that Twitter experience. If in some ways, I would say it's better, but people aren't there, so we're again in that situation. Distributed system could work like that. I also don't know how you do this on a planet-wide scale, but having some sort of joint ownership, like ownership from everybody, would be another way of doing that. So yes, you do have a central system, but it's I can't really say nationalized on a global scale. It's just like part of how the internet works, kind of set up.
I think I recall. So when WhatsApp started, I seem to recall that being a iPhone user, I paid an original £1.99 for it, or something like that. I've got a feeling that friends of mine that were Android users got it for free.
Yeah, right.
But they then had a 99p subscription every year.
Yeah.
Now,
You get the first year for free.
You got the first year free, and then you had a £1 a year for using a messaging service.
Yep.
Now, I don't know when that was scrapped. I also
Facebook bought it out.
Right, and I also don't fully understand why they decided to pick on Android users. But I'm fully in favour of that. I'm fully in favour that if you have a platform that you want to survive, you should pay for it. There's a very number of podcasts that I listen to. There's people on there that will say, if you're doing online backup, never, ever, ever go for a backup service that say you'll have unlimited backup for just £10 a month, because that business model doesn't work, or they don't mean unlimited.
Yeah, it's not truly unlimited. Yeah,
and so if what we're effectively saying is have everything for nothing, and that doesn't work. That's not sustainable.
Yeah, I did pay for myself my own subscription. And for the community I run, I would sometimes pay for other people's subscriptions for if someone couldn't afford, which does occasionally happen, and this is moving into the bigger point. But if someone couldn't afford the subscription, I'd quite often buy it for them, so that they could join in the community. Because if we're using this is kind of the catch-22. If you're using a chat system that is commercial for some sort of community, then that excludes people who can't pay for it. I agree, £1 a year is very, very low. But there definitely was times where it's like, look, I know it's only £1 a year, but I've got all this other stuff going on, and I don't even know if I'm going to use it that much.
Absolutely, and I think that's where what you actually need is a system that doesn't implement a subscription, but more, and this is going to sound like a horrible idea, effectively a tax that can be adjusted somehow. I'm not going to posit how, but would allow those that literally cannot afford to pay it, but can bring something to the platform to be wavered from it.
With global systems, this becomes an even bigger problem, because I kind of agree with the concept of we charge everyone what they can afford. But part of the reason the commercial side of WhatsApp was struggling, as far as I understand it, was that a lot of people outside of the Western world didn't have to pay to access it. Like maybe it was like they got a year free, and then they got another year free, and then they found another code somewhere, or whatever, however it worked. It wasn't monetized.
Yeah.
And that's because really there are people in the world, and they were trying to get a global messaging system. They came pretty close, billion or so people on it still. But there's a lot of those people that definitely cannot afford the £1 a year.
Yeah.
And that's the issue. Like, when you're trying to provide services for an entire globe, maybe it's something you can do without making money off of it in quite as direct a way. Especially because WhatsApp was a very lean operation. Like, they had everything else there. I was so disappointed when they sold to Facebook. Like,
and I remember at the time there was a big push by certain people to move on to other platforms then. And I just feel that it's an interesting time for wider people to be talking about this, because at the time that it was actually bought by Facebook, people didn't seem to care. And I don't think that Facebook was that much of a different company sort of 4 or 5 years ago when it was bought.
No, not at all. I think we all knew it was going to go this way, ultimately. I am amazed the end-to-end encryption has stuck around.
Ditto.
We don't have any evidence that they're taking data from the chats. Maybe they're not. Maybe they don't need that. I think that the fact that they are end-to-end encrypted probably also gives them some legal protection. Like they can't be forced to break someone's encryption if they can't.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily stop them in the future, at least, collecting data on the client sides and sending that up. So do the data processing on the ends, like the people who have sent and received messages, and send the bulk data up. Like if all you need to extract out of it is a few tags. These are the topics these people are interested in. These are the topics these people are interested in. Then you can probably get some pretty detailed information without ever seeing the messages, even if you know what they were talking about.
Yes.
And that probably violates most people's sense of privacy enough. Like, oh, great, you can't see the messages themselves is very much the technical definition of privacy.
I would perhaps counter your thought that most people would maybe not be happy with that, given how open people maybe not anymore are, because emails are sort of dropped out of fashion. But given how open people would have been at a time with email, perhaps not knowing, but basically, email had no encryption between you and me by default. Sure, maybe it would have encryption between me and my mail provider. Then across the internet and to you. But when it was at rest at my mail provider and at your mail provider, they can read that.
Yeah, no, you're right.
And people still today will go and buy things that they don't want people to know that they've bought, and be more than happy that they get an email receipt.
No, you're totally correct. Maybe people care less than we initially think, or I don't know. As well, at the same time, I suppose this starts to touch on a wider topic where the world has become so complex and so interlinked that trying to have any sort of expertise in every different area and be able to make all those value judgments for yourself is basically impossible at this stage. It probably has for a few hundred years, but definitely right now.
And like we said as well, even once let's suppose that you have made those value judgments, and you have decided that this is the one for you because it protects your freedoms, it protects your privacy, it protects all of this the best. It's no use if nobody else is there.
Yeah. You've got especially in that circumstance. Though I suppose in other ones, one of the examples I'll give is we were reviewing our pensions the other day, and I saw the growth of my pension. I'm not going to give out details or anything, but there's a bunch of different pension schemes I could move the money into, or investment pots I could move the money into, all of which have performed wildly differently over the last year. And I just don't know. Like, if I was going to move them, is that a good idea? Is it bad? How would I know? How would I personally feel about the morals of those investment portfolios? Like, there's thousands. I cannot possibly go through and judge all of that and work out where to go and what the correct one is. And that's something that I think is a very weird situation. We've created a world where everyone's expected to. Like, they can't, but everybody is expected to manage their own pension. Or at least a large number of people who have private pensions would be. And people are expected to understand the risks they're taking when they sign up for different web services and install different pieces of software. And I'm sure there's plenty of other scenarios you think about to sign up for a bank.
Basically, if you have in this day and age, and it is wider than this, but I think we could generalize by saying if you need a username and password, that's because that's basically anything these days. If you need a username and password, how much do you understand what you're signing up for?
Yeah, totally. No, you're completely right.
to carry on.
So I don't necessarily think there's easy solutions to that in terms of. I don't think you can ever create a situation where the individual could be responsible for all of that detail.
Yeah. So let's say we do move away from WhatsApp. We've got a number of options that we could go for, and I guess, let's be honest, there are probably as many different messaging services as there are.
Yeah, I think we went through some of them in our first episode? One of the early ones.
Quite possibly.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think a big one that a lot of people have said, is the thing to move to is Telegram.
Yep. I'm not so convinced by Telegram. A lot of the initial, I don't know what the encryption's like now, but a lot of the initial encryption work was like hand rolled by themselves, and that is definitely troubling. Like, it's not the approach you should be taking.
No, it's all as far as I understand it. It's all closed source. They're unwilling to let security researchers look at their code.
Wow,
to
even
validate it. I believe so. They have had some cryptography contests to get people to break it, and offered quite large rewards for that. But my understanding is they still haven't opened up their protocol to allow security researchers to actually get into it and verify it. Yep. I also seem to recall something that I've read recently on a sort of a comparison is that encryption isn't turned on by default. You've got to go and turn it on, which is fine.
Yeah.
But it means that those less savvy users are not going to turn it on. And should anything be said, joking or whatever, they are not protected by end-to-end encryption.
If it's not on as a default, it's basically not there. Right.
Yes. Now, Telegram has also been home to some less savoury groups of people. That's perhaps not fair to say, but certainly people that a lot of other people would not want to be associated with.
We're covering all the previous episodes. This is stuff we probably covered in the online extremism episode.
I believe so. And so especially to migrate to Telegram, forget to not turn on encryption for one of those chats. You're aiding a organization that is home to again a lot of groups of people that you do not want to be associated with, and that's a big reason for me not to even consider them. I know one big draw for a lot of people is that with WhatsApp, if you want to use their desktop or web services, your phone has to be connected. With Telegram, that's not the case.
Yeah, it's a separate connection,
and that's again, it's convenience over privacy and security.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'd rather have WhatsApp than Telegram. So
another big one that a lot of more tech savvy people will be looking at, and in fact, my app pinged several times a day telling me that people had joined Signal.
Yeah.
And Signal's a really interesting one because Signal popped up, I want to say a few years after WhatsApp, or certainly became somewhat popular a few years after WhatsApp. And it was a chance meeting by the original founder of WhatsApp and an engineer from Signal that actually WhatsApp uses, or at least used, I'm presuming it's still the same, the Signal protocol. So
for the encryption.
The Signal protocol and encryption is open source. People can go and verify it, and it has been verified by security researchers. And so actually, Signal is a very natural jump for me to go to because it already shares a lot of the good things about WhatsApp and isn't owned by Facebook or another large corporate body that maybe you wouldn't want getting hold of bits of data.
Though. That's the key difference there. We're still talking about a company.
Yes, and as far as I understand it, there is no federation there, so I cannot go and create my own app that conforms to the protocol and join in.
Yep.
And that's or a server. I can't go and create a server and get people to use the Signal app to join my server. So I think it's a step in the right direction. It's very much, I think, a step sideways from WhatsApp. It's no better, but it's no worse from what we've had for the last few years.
I mean, I agree it's better in that it's not Facebook, but that is about it, yeah.
So that sort of sums it up for me in terms of the big ones that I've heard of. Chris, have you heard of any other ones?
Nothing large. Everything else I was going to suggest is basically the taking the federated services and either hosting themselves or finding a host that you trust and taking that route. That's, I think, going to be a lot more effort than moving people onto Signal or Telegram.
And I think it's worth mentioning just very briefly that not that they're necessarily better because they're owned by companies, but there are the likes of Slack and Discord and struggling to think about this, but for me, although it's all instant messaging, if you will, it's very much a different class of it.
So both of them as well, both of them don't have end-to-end encryption as far as I understand it. They're both client-server encryption.
Yes, but my what I was getting at was that they're both different models in that although you can do direct messaging, they are very much set up as a sort of a pull model. You set up a room that is public and you allow people to be pulled into it.
There's a really interesting part of like human psychology where we're essentially talking about apps that send messages to each other. And humanity has created thousands of them. And I know I was earlier suggesting that network effects mean that one or two seem to be the victor. I still think that's the case. But as soon as you change the context of the messaging a little bit, just a tiny bit, like it might be on your PC while you're playing games or whatever else, it only takes a few key features to flip the balance back, and all of a sudden everybody's moving to use a different app. So I'd also like to talk about a state of computer hardware, particularly looking forward. I don't know if you've seen much of the hardware market at the moment, Ben. There are significant supply issues. If you want to, I imagine there are supply issues throughout the supply chain at the moment with coronavirus, and it is currently very, very difficult to get your hands on a GPU or a CPU. CPUs seem to be a little bit easier. At the same time, some really impressive hardware has been released. NVIDIA came out with their new 3000 series, and AMD has come out with their 5000 series. And yeah, it's a weird time when it's actually really... It's a really exciting time to be into hardware and wanting something new or buying something new, but it's also kind of depressing when you can't get the thing that you know is good.
Yes.
I myself have been very fortunate, I should say. I've managed to get the parts that I wanted without too much difficulty, but I do know plenty of other people that have been unable to get hold of what they wanted. And this got me thinking about kind of where it's going. I think we've both said in the past that in the sort of the decade we were both at uni, computer hardware very quickly got out of date. And you know, it could be just a matter of 2 or 3 years from buying a computer until you couldn't use it for everything. Like, keeping a piece of old hardware around suddenly became not just a chore, but like there was something you were missing out on at the very least.
There was very much two things just to say on that very quickly. You had, shall we say, alternative computing platforms. I'm looking at Apple here. That their users were, I have bought a Mac. I have spent a lot of money on it. This Mac is going to last me 7 years.
Yep.
And Apple was very good at that because they controlled the whole stack from, they worked with IBM for the PowerPC chips, and they did everything from hardware to software.
Yeah.
They could do that.
Yep.
So as well as Apple's sort of alternative platform, if you were keeping old hardware around,
Yep.
it was because you were a hobbyist and you had you wanted to tinker with some weird Linux that
Yeah,
you could
definitely.
put on this old bit of hardware and, really squeeze the last bit of life out of it.
Yeah.
But it was something that you enjoyed doing and not something you wanted to do. Not something that the everyday person would want to do.
Yeah, definitely. Whereas I think my experience, certainly of the last 10 years, has been more that hardware has stuck around for a long time. Admittedly, it is a MacBook, but I've got a 8-year-old MacBook that I still use. It's fine for what I use it for. I'm not, using it for super impressive gaming, but even then, a lot of the software solutions have fixed that, so I can now go and use game streaming services to stream from my gaming PC or anything else that I would like to do, really.
And very much the same here. I've got a laptop that is from, I think, 2013.
Yep.
Still works just fine, does everything I want it to do.
Yep.
And really, the things that are slow on it are things like it's got a hard drive still rather than SSD,
Right, yeah.
which is easily fixed
Yeah, you can
by
upgrade
putting
that.
an SSD in it.
Yeah.
Up until last summer, I was still using an iMac that was built in 2011, and it was doing everything I wanted to just fine. The only reason I replaced it was because I'd stopped getting even, I think, security updates from Apple.
Yeah.
Certainly, I couldn't bump up major versions of macOS.
Yeah.
And it was only an amount of time before it was effectively worthless.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think computer hardware started lasting a bit longer. Some of this, I think, is more directly attributable to Intel being unable to really get the scale down past 14 nanometers. As other chip fabricators have managed to do that, then it does seem as if that we're kind of maybe not back to Moore's law, because I think both you and I agree that direction is definitely slowing down. It's the other end of the S curve at the moment. But we're definitely getting faster than we were. And I'm wondering if we're going to see, is it possible that for the next 10 years we see a situation where actually computer hardware starts increasing at that pace again, or improving at that pace again, and we end up where, a 5-year-old computer is basically end of life. You can't even reasonably reuse it for anything. That definitely has negative side effects. I was quite happy that computers would last as long as they would.
It takes a lot of energy and resources to make a computer.
Exactly, yeah.
And being able to use the same one for 5, 7, 10 years means that you don't have to manufacture a new case. In that, an awful lot of people will be using laptops, and you won't just upgrade bits in it. You don't have to manufacture a new case, a new screen, a new GPU, CPU, motherboard. If it does you for what you're doing every day, then that's great. And the only thing you perhaps want to consider is a new computer on an everyday basis going to give you such better power consumption, power usage, that you're doing more damage by having this old thing around.
Very unusual that's the case. Unusual.
That's offset by the fact that a new computer
it's got to
costs so much to the planet.
Yeah, exactly. So the other thing I think that's changed, and we'll find out how it's going to scale, but multiple cores. We got stuck for a quad core for a very long time, and now 6, 8, 12, 16 cores is becoming more commonplace on desktop. And I think that's I previously would have said, what difference does it make? It's almost it gets ridiculous when you've got so many cores. But something that I have thought about that the ordinary user might have a bigger problem with actually is background processing. There's an awful lot of programs on a modern PC that just sit in the background doing their little task. Whether it's a game store or antivirus or anything else. And I could imagine that a multi-core, a high multi-core computer for a normal ordinary user would actually feel quite a bit faster because all those background tasks are just out of the way. And we might go, well, we can clean them up, but they're not really going to do that.
No. It's an interesting one as well. I think about 12 or 13 years ago, I was working for Sun Microsystems, and they had a couple of different systems. One of their systems was a highly threaded CPU system that really took advantage of multi-core processing or sort of multi-threaded processing, and also just applications like a web server that naturally has, each connection is a thread. So each core in itself wasn't particularly powerful. It didn't push anything through particularly quickly, but it could handle a lot of work without slowing down. And I kind of came out of my year at Sun thinking that's how computing was going to go. And in fact, around about that time, we had people like Apple coming out with Grand Central Dispatch to make it easier for Mac OS or OS 10 developers at the time to create multi-threaded applications. And that just hasn't really happened still. No. It is getting there, but a lot of applications are still very much single-threaded.
I do think it's a fundamentally difficult problem. Like, it's not something that we're just going to snap our fingers and solve. I think it's much easier to solve for a certain, well, at least it appears from what gets produced, it's much easier to solve for like a given subset. So consoles tend to find it relatively easy to scale across all the cores because they're used to working with that CPU architecture and that number of cores. Which is why I think there'll probably be a bias towards 8 cores for quite a while to come, with certainly with this console generation and with PC gaming. I definitely think the direction going forward is to more cores. It's very interesting that you raised the point about them being lower powered cores and having more of them. And spreading the workload out across them. Modern CPUs are going to sort of a hybrid situation where, I mean, they do it in different ways. So the M1 chip that Apple have released has this that has the high performance cores and the low performance cores, so they can go into a really low power state. But even a modern day AMD or Intel CPU will clock an awful lot higher if only 1 or 2 cores are being activated. If you just got a single threaded processor, it will overclock that core significantly more than if everything was being used. All the cores were being used on a more multi-threaded process. And so we're kind of in this world where there's possibly going to be the best of both kind of situations.
I think, to throw sort of another angle in as well, I think perhaps my worry is for the future, which I think could bring us into this world where we do have to recycle every sort of 3 years or insert time frame here. Is Apple's M1 chip. Now, it's phenomenal. It's really powerful. People are raving about it from what I've heard. My worry is that there's, I think Linus Torvalds has said he doesn't expect Linux to get ported to it ever. I don't know that Microsoft have got any interest in porting Windows to it. I don't know if Apple have any interest in supporting Boot Camp on it anymore. This I think brings 2 things. One, it is very much a break. At some point, your Intel Mac is not going to receive. It's not only not going to receive any updates, but it's going to require much more additional effort for someone like Mozilla or Google to keep Chrome and Firefox running on your Intel Mac. So they're just going to stop. So even if you've got a perfectly workable machine, you're going to have out-of-date software on it. So that's sort of like the one thing that is very much an Apple's problem, if you like, or Apple users' problem. The other thing that I'm slightly worried about is, yes, ARM is brilliant, ARM is great, but one ARM chip is not the next ARM chip. And so while I can quite freely switch between an Intel and an AMD, sure, I've got to have a new motherboard and bits and bobs like that. I can't just go and put Mac OS or Linux or Windows on brand new ARM chip that new company came out with, because it doesn't work like that. And if we're going towards ARM and away from x86, which I'm not convinced at, but Apple's doing it, and Apple do have a history of being maybe a few years ahead of interesting ideas, shall we say?
Yep.
If I put it that way,
Or
not necessarily good ideas, but
who just copy what Apple does, or whatever it is. Yeah,
exactly. That perhaps hails back an era close to what we saw in the 70s and 80s, where you had lots of people making bespoke hardware, which was perhaps very, very good, but very, very poor for interoperability, and maybe had, through sort of consciously or not, design built-in obsolescence.
Yeah, that's an interesting situation, because of course I'd forgotten how much ARM CPUs run on slightly varying different instruction sets, don't they? So you have to compile it for every instruction that's for bunch.
And it's not even things like the fact that the way they boot up is different.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You whereas we've got on x86 you've got a fairly standard way of you put this stuff here on the disk and you put that stuff there on the disk, and fine, it's all a little bit different now. We're on EFI, but my understanding with ARM is each chip has their own like boot code to get you into the OS, and your OS needs to sort of understand that.
Yeah.
And,
okay, so you could have some significant differences between each platform.
Yes.
I think Apple are going to bear that cost for them. For them, it makes perfect sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting bits is they wrote an extension to the chip, or they created a hardware extension to the chip and the instruction set that helps. I can't remember what instruction it is now, but it helps emulate part of the x86 or x64 instruction set, which means that they can do that emulation much, much, much quicker than they would normally be able to. Comparisons are getting up to like 80% of the speed, which is really getting to a stage where you're like, yeah, that's fine. There's no cost from the user's perspective, really. And the low-powered cores are giving them iPad-like battery life, so you're looking at 20 hours battery life for a laptop, which is pretty big. That's that's a long time. And if they can deliver sort of Mac Pro sort of performance in the MacBook Pros, then I think they've got I think they made the right decision for Apple. Yes. Whether the rest of the industry follows suit, there's a chance that people will go, well, Apple are doing it, so it must be the right thing. And we could be into a situation as well where hardware is more integrated. Like it's more, you just buy it as this thing for most people.
I do wonder on this, and it's slightly away from maybe where our topic was going. I do wonder whether Apple may do their thing on their ARM chip, but actually it wouldn't surprise me if you get the likes of Asus and Dell and all the other ones have dropped out of my head.
Yeah,
but if you look at sort of general computer hardware laptop makers of today,
OEMs,
it really wouldn't it really wouldn't surprise me if they sort of group around a particular kind of ARM chip.
Yeah, I agree.
And actually, because that allows them to share a lot and reduce costs. And it really wouldn't surprise me then, because they can also have a partnership with Microsoft and it runs everywhere. Simple for Microsoft, simple for business. That might make sense, but you've still got this world now where Microsoft and everyone that runs that is running on this, and Apple is running on something else. And again, that's just where we were 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. I think it's just happening. I don't know if there's much you can do about it. We could end up in a situation where everyone ends up on ARM, which
would be really interesting to see what happens to AMD and Intel.
Yeah, in that scenario, yeah, definitely. Something else I'm really... I don't know enough about the industry to really have a strong opinion on this, but Intel not being able to scale their fabrication process down is really costing them now. Like, it's it's been, I don't know how many plus architectures they're on now, but it's been what was it, 2015-ish, I think, when they came out with the 14 nanometer CPU processors. And I suppose I'm interested if you think they're going to catch up. Like, they keep managing to pull a rabbit out of the hat and getting a processor that's better, but ultimately I can't see them doing that without reducing the size of manufacturing.
It's an interesting one. I think that if we look at history, we can see a point where Intel had very, very poor, in comparison to AMD, single-core performance on their single-core CPUs.
Yep.
There was a time, sort of 2004-ish, when AMD were winning over Intel, shall we put it that way. And then Intel came out with the Core Duo, and that generation of the core architecture.
Yep.
That trounced what AMD were doing at the time, and AMD really struggled to catch up. It took them years. They went through varying models of 3-core processors that were like a quad-core processor with a failed core, which is legitimately how processors are made.
Yeah, they're just technically still doing that, but just with more cores.
But everybody does. You know, Intel will make... My understanding is that chip makers make the best processors, and then go, that one's a bit crap.
Yeah,
we'll market that as a lower, and then they can twiddle some knobs and tune it down if it's just a little bit too good, but not as good as it ought to be. But AMD were basically doing that and still not doing that well. And then only in the last few years have they really overtaken Intel again, and they're doing so much better.
Yep.
So
it's only been this generation, the 5000 series, where they could decisively say they were better at Intel's processors on every metric other than price for performance. Like, price for performance, they did decide to be a little bit... They upped the prices, like everybody has.
Yes. Oh, and this was it. That I'm sure that when I started building my own computers, it was cheaper for me to get an Intel processor because they weren't that good. And when I was looking before at buying building a new computer, AMD was cheaper because they weren't that good compared.
Yep.
Now they're better, and they...
they've immediately rammed the prices up to match because they know the market will switch.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it really wouldn't surprise me if Intel... I think perhaps 3 things are going to happen. The obvious one that could happen is they don't, and they get kicked out of the processor game. I don't think that will happen. I think that what could be more likely, because that would of course cause AMD to have a monopoly. I think it would be interesting to think that in the same way that that Intel had to license the x86 instruction sets to AMD, and then AMD had to license the 64-bit ones back to Intel. I wonder if it would be an interesting thought whether that AMD could potentially license some sort of fabrication method to Intel, in order to get Intel competitive again, shall we say? So that's, or I think
so AMD
through some method.
AMD don't do any of their own fabbing, so I don't think it would quite work like that.
No, but but I think that the other option is that Intel do, if not pull ahead, come up to match AMD. And I think that happens in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
They get external help in the same way that AMD have external fabricators, Intel could look out. It really wouldn't surprise me. This is the way that things sort of sometimes happen in Silicon Valley. If Intel brought on someone quite high up from AMD.
Yeah, I mean, you say that an awful lot of the engineers that were at Intel have moved to AMD.
Yes.
And I think there's basically two ways out of this for Intel. One is just literally, as you say, they successfully managed to find a way of designing a smaller node, and they make it on a smaller node. If they only do that once, though, they've got to keep doing that. Like, doing it once doesn't solve the problem. They've got to do it and then do it again, and they've already fallen behind by at least a generation. I think Intel, the way Intel measures the nodes, means that really what they call 14 is kind of closer to what everybody else calls 10, give or take. It's a bit approximate. Okay. Even now, you're talking about what the M1 chip's 5 nanometer. So
yes,
Intel's even on that metric at least a generation behind. So Intel redesigned their CPU architecture for the 10 or 11 series that went onto laptops, and that was printed at 10 nanometer. And that was good, that was fine, but they couldn't get the yields up high enough to justify that for desktop class processors, so they're back porting the architecture, the 10 nanometer architecture, to 14 nanometer, and capping the cores at 8 per chip. And this is very unusual. We were saying earlier, we've been used to a situation where technology keeps moving forward and keeps getting better, and that was part of the reason why sort of in the early 2000s a computer would age so quickly. And now we're talking about companies having to literally roll an architecture back to a previous process node.
I think as well, slightly less on the strictly hardware front, although very, very closely linked to it. Intel have had a problem with the Spectre Meltdown vulnerabilities that I believe their hardware is still, their architecture is still vulnerable to. They've sort of put some mitigations in place, but they've not designed it out. They've put mitigations in place. And so actually what they currently have now is a technology that they're backporting to an older process, working with an architecture that is flawed.
Yeah.
And what they really need to do is quite quickly get an entire new redesign of the process and the architecture together.
Yeah, they've got a lot of catching up to do at the very least. I don't want to say I feel for Intel, but I can imagine there's a lot going on there if they're really trying to dig themselves out of it. I think long term, we probably are going to see an increase in price for computer hardware. Probably beyond an inflationary price. I really hope that the software engineering side of things can do enough to keep that hardware lasting longer, because I think people are happier, and I think it's better for the planet overall if I can buy a computer every 10 years and know that it's going to last, and not have to think about, I might have to replace certain components in 3 years' time, or the whole thing in 3 years' time. And I think that makes the cost more bearable. But given the changes that seem to be happening in the industry, and they're becoming longer and longer term, I think we might have a period of pretty expensive computer parts coming up. Certainly for the next couple of years, possibly for the next decade.
Yes. Talking about hardware, obviously we've been talking about commodity hardware, and perhaps the Apple M1 doesn't quite fall into that, but it also leads to an interesting discussion around mobile phone hardware. And we saw back in the early iPhone days, I'm a terrible Android person. I have no idea about them. Between like the first and second generation iPhones, we saw massive jumps in capabilities. And although Apple will tell you that this generation is 30% better at, or 30 times better at doing X than the previous generation was, largely, in my experience, you jump up a generation at a time and your overall experience isn't drastically improved. There's some edge cases, there might be some games that are better, but overall usability is the same. And what's kind of interesting there is I wonder if we'll see going into the future maybe every other year updates to phone hardware, or whether they're really going to sort of juice as much as they can this idea that everyone's got to have the latest and greatest and keep on bringing a new phone out every single year.
I think Apple's already kind of hedged their bets on that. Like they've still got that brand where the new stuff has to come out, but they at the same time have diversified their hardware. They've got a lot more different types of iPhone. So the idea is that you can buy one for you, that's appropriate for your needs. And at the same time, they've curated this image of it like lasting a long time and providing the support and the maintenance. And sure, they definitely had some problems with that in terms of like the battery scandal, where they underclocked the CPU if your battery got too old or stopped providing enough power. But I do understand some degree of why they did that. They totally should have informed users. They should have made that way more transparent.
Yes.
But
and I suppose in the end of the day, what we're saying is that Apple have that brand where they can do that, and because Apple do that, they also legitimize it for a whole host of Android manufacturers, whether or not they still have that sort of brand to do it.
I think it's something Android's missing out on a lot, and I would be much more willing to spend an awful lot of money on a phone if I knew it was going to last me 5 years.
Yes.
I think a lot of people are in that situation. They're fine spending decent money on something if it's going to last.
Absolutely.
The problem is most Android phones, they get updates for 2 years, 3 years. I've got a OnePlus, and I think it's no longer being updated. So OnePlus 6, it's no more than 3 years old. And I think it's still security updates, but it really should be getting all the functionality updates that come with a normal Android phone, even now. There's no reason for the world to be in that situation. We should be able to support older hardware for much longer, and I really hope that trend at the very least continues.
Thanks for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at tech_point_0. We hope you join us again for the next episode.
Bye.